This whole idea of macroeconomics and macroeconomic goals and macroeconomic performance as measured in GDP and employment and equality and inflation and all of these things leads us to a question, which is, can we do something collectively, so not just acting on our own, but can we do something as a society through that thing that we use to accomplish things as a society, that is the government? Can we use the government to influence those outcomes? Can we use the government to control some of these things or to make the system work better? Complicating this question is the fact that the economy itself is extremely complicated, far more complicated than anything else you're going to study in school. It's 300 million people and more making decisions minute by minute about everything in their lives. That's the economy. It isn't a thing. It would be much easier to study if it were a thing. Instead, it's a system, and an extremely complicated system. And because it's so complicated, basically people are in two camps about government action in regards to it. One of which is that we should take a generally hands-off approach, and the other of which is that we should be pretty hands-on and try to solve various problems that are going on. Now, very few people suggest that there should be no government at all, because everybody, for the most part, agrees that government has to do a few things, and we'll talk about that. And there's almost nobody that suggests that government should control everything, because we recognize that that's practically impossible. I or any one of us could hardly control one other person, even if we made it our entire life's work. So the idea that the government could completely control everything is sort of beyond the pale. But we generally find that people fall into the camp of more government involvement in the economy or less. Now, I want to say at the outset that economic analysis can only tell us so much about this argument, because there are a lot of things about this argument that go beyond mere economic well-being into the realm of morality and other areas of philosophy. So, for example, it's possible and perfectly legitimate to believe that the government should control as much of the economy as it can, even if it would make everybody poorer, if you also believe that the concept of private property is immoral. It's also possible and perfectly legitimate to believe that the government shouldn't control anything in the economy, if you believe that government control is immoral and freedom is the most important thing, even if everybody would be economically worse off or poorer. That is, both of those things are possible and legitimate. Just the economic analysis can't really speak to those things. We can only speak to just what will the economic results of these things be. I'm going to start off by talking about freedom, because in this country at least, and for many economists, probably most economists around the world, the presumption is in favor of freedom. In other words, that people should be able to dispose of their property and earn property as they see fit, and that government intrusion should be targeted, minimal, for a specific purpose. So we're going to start off on the freedom. Now, one of the earliest and most important economic thinkers that you're going to need to know about is Adam Smith, sort of Scottish philosopher, not just an economist, but a philosopher in general. And in the auspicious year of 1776, Adam Smith published a book called The Wealth of Nations. You guys have read portions of that book. He said a lot of important things in that book, but one of the most important things he said was that people's self-interest will drive them to provide other people's wants and needs, so that they can exchange those wants and needs for something that they want. And in that way, everybody's wants and needs are sort of going to be satisfied. And not only that, but everybody makes pretty much the right amount of all of the stuff, because making more would be costly, and making less means that they're giving up some possible profit. So everybody's directed not by a government agency, but by what he called almost an invisible hand. Okay, so this is called the invisible hand of the marketplace. And you guys have seen this already in a different form, which is a free market system of prices. Okay, so I talked very briefly about how prices freely, undirected by government and just freely moving based on supply and demand, will sort of automatically ration goods. If something becomes sort of limited in supply, like say our world supply of oil runs out or it appears to be running out, then the price will sort of go up, which will encourage people to marginally begin to use more and more of other sources of fuel, encourage people to develop technologies using other sorts of fuel, and it all sort of is very efficient. So everything flows, all the resources flow to their most efficient uses. So it turns out, and this is a common myth that students seem to have, students seem to believe that efficiency means that somebody needs to be in charge, and if nobody's in charge, there's not efficiency. Well, it turns out that in the economy, the most efficient thing is for no one to be in charge, just to sort of leave the system to itself. Then all the resources will flow exactly where they should go at the time that they should go there, all mediated by prices. Of course, this requires government still to do a few things. Okay, this whole system doesn't really operate very well if people don't have control over their own property. If they don't have control over their own property, then they can't exchange, obviously. So the government has to be there to protect their property rights, which is the first important form of government involvement that almost everybody agrees on, that the government is going to have to secure property rights. And the second thing is that no trading can happen if their contracts are not necessarily going to be honored. So, for example, I might give you something now in exchange for the promise of something later. Well, if I have no assurance that you're going to give me that thing later, then the whole system of trade is going to break down. I'm not going to make any trades based on promises. I'm only going to trade for what I can see, right? Show me the money. But we have the government step in to guarantee contracts. So if the person I'm trading with doesn't honor his contract, I can sue him for the stuff. So those are two really important functions of government, even for somebody who advocates market freedom. Now, the same thing applies when it comes to trade between countries. I want to clarify that international trade is not when one government trades a bunch of stuff with another government. It's all businesses and people trading across borders. But English economist David Ricardo proved several centuries ago that it's always more efficient for countries to trade freely with each other and not to have trade barriers like tariffs or import quotas or things like that. It's always more efficient to do that, even for countries that produce everything better than any other country. So even if in the United States there's no product that we would produce worse than another country or at a higher cost, there's still an opportunity cost, right? Making that item means that we can't make some other item. So let's take an example that might be becoming outdated, but in the United States, textiles used to be a very big industry. Okay, so there used to be a lot of people involved in making cheap t-shirts, basically. Okay, we don't do that anymore. After a while, we devoted more of our resources to producing more high-tech electronics and things like that, and we outsourced a lot of those jobs. Okay, it's not that we can't do those jobs better. Still, our workers are probably among the best in the world. Okay, but we outsourced those because the opportunity cost of making those shirts was much higher for us, because one more person in the textile industry maybe means one less person in manufacturing televisions or automobiles or something like that. Whereas, for another country, then manufacturing textiles might be their best option. Okay, it might have a very low opportunity cost for them. So the law of comparative advantage states that even a country that could make anything better than anybody else, it's still better for them to focus on a few things. Okay, so there are a lot of advantages to that kind of international trade. Now, there are a few examples of things that everyone recognizes: the market, free market, without any government involvement, okay, besides the contract thing and the property thing, but ways that the free market will not do the most efficient thing, and those are called market failures. Okay, so it's a market failure when the market on its own will not deliver goods or will not deliver something in the most efficient way, or enough of something, or it'll deliver too much of something, more than would be efficient. Okay, and there are basically two kinds of market failure that I'm going to talk about, which are public goods on the one hand, and on the other hand, externalities. Now, I want to say about public goods, a public good is not anything that the government provides, right? If the government had a program to provide free coffee to everyone, 1 cup of coffee every day, that would not qualify as a public good. It just qualifies as something the government, for some reason, decided to do. Public goods generally are things that are expensive enough that individuals wouldn't want to do them on their own. So if an individual tried to do it, it would be more expensive than the benefit he would receive. But if we do it as a society through the government, then it actually benefits each individual more than the taxes he would have to pay for it. So things like that are like the roads, or the fire department, the police department, the military, public schools, things like that. Those are public goods because the expense to each individual person of doing it on their own would be probably way too much. And not only that, it would be very difficult to exclude other people from enjoying the benefits of what you spent. Like, for example, fire departments, you can't, just refuse to put out a fire in somebody else's house because they didn't pay the fee, because other surrounding houses might catch fire. So that kind of thing is a public good. And that's a market failure because if the government doesn't step in, it's probably not going to happen, or it's not going to happen enough. The other example of market failure is an externality. And externalities are when basically some third party receives a benefit from something that somebody else does, or receives some harm from something that somebody else does. So there are a couple classic examples of externalities, but externalities can be good or bad. For example, education has a lot of positive externalities. You actually want other people to be educated because educated people are less likely to commit crimes. They're more likely to have a higher income and contribute, tax money to the government. They're more likely to invent things that you will enjoy. So that's a positive externality. When there are positive externalities, the market on its own won't produce enough of that thing. So we want the government to step in and encourage more of that thing, in this case education, to be produced. And there are also negative externalities like pollution. Okay, when it comes to pollution, maybe, to use a crude example, maybe there's a factory that's dumping stuff in a river. Okay, there's a social cost to that. We don't want that to happen that much. Maybe a little bit is okay because we still want the production from that factory. But the business will unquestionably do more of that than is probably socially the best, because all they see is their profit from their production. They don't bear the cost that all the people living downriver will bear. That's a negative externality, and you want to not prevent that entirely, but at least make sure it happens in an efficient amount, which is going to be lower than the amount that the market on its own will provide. Needless to say, there are going to be a lot of disagreements among people, even people who aren't on the extremes of freedom or control, about what is appropriate for the government to do, or how the government should tackle some of these problems. But let's go to the opposite extreme and just talk about government control over the economy. Okay, so government control, it's fairly straightforward. There's going to be a government agency or many government agencies that will control different aspects of the economy, in some way, shape, or form. It might be like a communist system that is very authoritarian and uses force. It might just be some kind of socialist democratic system that does everything on a democratic basis. But one way or another, the government is in charge. And there are a lot of misconceptions about this. A lot of people tend to think that putting the government in charge would really help efficiency. That's not true. When government takes control of the economy, it's highly inefficient. For the very reason that I talked about at the beginning of this video. The economy is extremely complicated, far more complicated than any individual or any group of individuals could probably hope to understand. As an example, at the height of the Soviet Union, they were trying to control something like 27 million different prices. No one can reasonably expect to do that. Okay, but control is really good for very specific tasks. For example, it's really good at making sure that everyone is equal. Okay, that's pretty easy to do. It might be equal in their poverty, but it's pretty easy to make everybody equal. Also, it's very good for stability, right? You can come to some kind of state, but you can ensure that there is no change, that new inventions that would throw everything off and put some people out of a job, even if they would benefit most people, you can ensure that that never happens, okay? And you have stability. And you can make sure that everybody's employed. If you had to, you could just stick them all in the army. But in terms of just efficiency, it also entails a lot of bureaucracy. They don't have all the information that they could. And they're going to take into account their priorities, whatever those are. And people differ in respect to their priorities. Some people want a lot of books, and other people are going to want to play video games a lot. And other people are just going to want to go on vacation to tropical locales. But the government really is going to have their set of priorities. So those are some of the considerations that go into government control. So there it is, freedom and control. Now, I hope so this is a very complicated issue, right? There are a lot of not just economic considerations, but moral considerations, ethical considerations, philosophical considerations. It really overlaps a lot with government philosophy, political philosophies. But this is not even though there are theoretical things about this debate, this is highly untheoretical in your life. Even though, we have a constitution, and even though there are certain things we take for granted, things are always changing, and we're always having a debate between more control, or what kinds of control, and less control. And these things affect your lives in very significant ways. And there are some debates that are going on right now over legislation that will affect your lives in very significant ways. And it's important that you be attentive to this, because you do have some control over this. And you should have some control over this. That's what it means to be in a democracy. So I want you to be well informed about it, but I want you to be able to talk about these things, and willing and desirous of talking about these things amongst each other in a civil and agreeable way.